Well, here we are once again, Robin. I'm glad to have you here again. You were a good sport during the last interview, I have to admit.
That's very gracious of you to say that. I'm glad to be here and have a second bash at it.
What are you writing these days?
Well, I'm doing some freelance work for the American Psychological Association. I felt it was time that they updated the EPPP, which is the licensure exam that psychologists have to take to be licensed. I felt it was time to introduce a third part. You know, they had the EPPP, which
What is the EPPP?
well, it was a list of questions to assess a candidate's knowledge of the psychology field. But then they introduced EPPP Part 2, which is designed to assess a candidate's skills. So you have to have the knowledge to be a psychologist. You also have to have the skills. Well, what I'm trying to introduce is EPPP Part 3 to just assess how they measure on the touchy-feely index. It's very important to have psychologists who don't just have a lot of head knowledge, they're not just geeky people, but they really have that touchy-feely component that is so critical to therapeutic practice.
Especially today. And
Especially today.
Can you give us a, for instance, how you're updating it?
You know, sensitivity to microaggressions would be high on the touchy-feely index. You know, are you familiar with the theory of microaggressions?
Yeah, of course.
So I feel like we need to get a little more granular and introduce what I call milliaggressions. So the best way to think about it is a milliaggression is to a microaggression what a microaggression is to aggression. So aggressive behavior would be something like, ah, whereas a microaggression would just be, ah. Whereas the milliaggression would be something like, maybe you didn't even notice it. And that's the whole point. It's very, very subtle.
Wow, that's funny. Are you kidding me, bro? What's new with Robin and Boom these days? What's on the agenda for you guys?
Oh, well, you know, the Robin and Boom show, now I'm being serious now. The Robin and Boom show has kind of slowed down a little bit because my podcast partner, Jason, has been off in Siberia.
On honeymoon? Honeymooning?
Yes, exactly. I didn't know, I wasn't going to say that because I didn't know whether it was public yet, but.
In Siberia?
Yes, that's right. Siberia of all places. But I kept the show ticking away at a slower schedule. So I recently did a podcast with Bill Cabacinci, who is a ethics professor at Washington State University. And we have some other very good thinkers lined up in the days ahead. So the Robin and Boom show is still on the air. It's still ticking away, but at a slower pace, given some of Jason's recent adventures, and given I have an increased workload at the moment as well.
Well, in the last interview we did, you talked about positive thinking, and I wanted to go more in depth with this. And just tell me, why is it important to think right?
A people cannot be free unless they have the means of distinguishing between truth and falsehood. And that includes being able to distinguish truth and falsehood in all the automatic thoughts that flow through our brain every minute. Every minute our thinking happens almost outside our control. We have hundreds of thoughts that just come in and out of our mind. And when you really start thinking about thinking, then you can exercise some censorship over these automatic thoughts and really do like the apostle said, take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. I'm a Christian, and I believe that Jesus Jesus' lordship extends even over our own brains and our thoughts.
Well, you know, and this might be getting into a little side road here, but one of the things I spend a lot of time looking at is the narratives that are spun by the media. And it seems like in the same way, they bombard us with all these thoughts, and people can take them for true and not really examine the source, or if they have maybe a financial incentive to keep the delusion going.
Yes, the media can be very biased, and it's easy to fall into a sort of tribalism where we just listen to the voices that feed us what we want to hear, and we don't avail ourselves of things that may challenge us, things that may stretch us, things that may challenge our cognitive biases.
Mm-hmm. So what are some examples of some logical fallacies?
Oh, so there are informal fallacies like okay, the genetic fallacy, what C.S. Lewis called Bulverism. If I say,
tell us about that.
Where you attack somebody's statements or opinions based on their motivation or based on the alleged origin of those statements. So if I say, you're just saying that because you're a man, or oh, I can disregard what you just say because you're a former Marxist, or whatever, where I instead of engaging with the truth content of the statements, I dismiss it based on the origin of those statements.
Is that similar to the ad hominem fallacy?
It's, yes, it may even be a subtype of ad hominem fallacies, I don't know. An ad hominem fallacy is when you attack someone personally rather than actually criticizing their beliefs.
And why did C.S. Lewis give a new name, Bulverism, to this fallacy?
You know, I can't remember. He invented a fictional character that whose life experiences in childhood had led him to invent this era of thinking. There's something like that. I can't really remember exactly.
Why is it called the genetic fallacy?
Well, the genetic has to do with the origins of something. I imagine that the case. I'm not a linguist, but
can you give us for instance, maybe a concrete example that you heard recently on the news?
I'm not sure if I can, but I'll give you a perfect example. The border wall. Okay, that's very controversial.
Sure.
And when Democrats who used to support more border security, which included fences, they're now saying, many of them are saying, oh, Trump's proposals can be dismissed because he's racist. There's an allegedly racist motivation behind that. So policies that were at one time accepted among certain Democrats are now being dismissed because of the alleged origin behind it. So a genetic fallacy is when you dismiss something, dismiss an argument, or in this case a policy, not on the merits of the thing itself, but because of the genesis, if you will.
I can think of an example. Recently, the Congress condemned Trump for racism because he was criticizing the ideas of a Congresswoman, Ilhan Omar, I think her name is, from Sudan. And because she's a woman, because she's black, they said that Trump was going after her because she was a woman and because she was black, rather than saying, well, maybe it was the idea that he was going after.
Yeah, that's actually an example of mind reading, which is a thinking error.
And we want to talk about thinking errors.
But I was just to mention, if Trump had have told a Russian person, to go back to Russia, that wouldn't mean that he was racist against whites. Now he may have been racist when he made those remarks, but there was a lot that was read into those tweets. And I'm not justifying what he said, or it was very tasteless and an example of his bombast and inflaming cultural divisions. But the allegations that there was racism there did involve quite a lot of mind reading. And as I said, if he had have told a white person of Russian ancestry to go back to Russia, nobody would have been calling bloody murder about him being racist.
No, they would have said that he's a Russian agent. What's the difference between logical fallacies and thinking errors?
So logical fallacies are wrong arguments, faulty, specious ways of constructing argumentation, whereas thinking errors are more wrong processes of thought. And I don't know if I don't know if that's a good way of explaining it. I haven't really thought about a formal definition, but as we get into some of the thinking errors, it'll probably become clearer how those differ from.
What are some examples of thinking errors?
Well, one is just what I talked about a minute ago, just mind reading. So you can see thinking errors are more psychological in nature. And one of the psychological problem that we have is that a lot of people have, I know I do it, we tend to think we can know what other people are thinking. We tend to read their minds. Like, oh, this person must have been thinking this about me when he said that, or when he looked at me like that. And we do that a lot in relationships, where we will twist and redefine what other people say because we're maybe assuming something negative that's behind it. And I mean, in relationships with people you know very well, there is a kind of empathic accuracy, an intuition where you can pick up on what people are thinking and feeling. That's central to emotional intelligence and empathy. But sometimes you have to just stop and say, hey, were you thinking this when you said that? Were you, okay, let me, I can give you some specific examples. I have some notes somewhere on my computer about mind reading. I can give you some examples from some fictional scenarios, if that would be helpful. I don't know how deep you want to go into.
Maybe just give us one or two.
Okay.
We want to try to keep this as off the cuff as possible, but give us one or two.
Okay. So here's an example. When Leah and Matthew Walker lived in Montana, no one at their church ever questioned their decision to homeschool. But then when they moved to California for employment reasons, their new parish, there was a great deal of judgment about their decision to homeschool. And the people were starting to say things like, oh, they're trying to shelter their children, they're afraid of the world, they're overprotective and so forth. And no one ever actually asked Leah and Matthew why they decided to homeschool. People just assumed they knew it, and then used that as the basis of negative judgment. And so it's very helpful for relationships to be healthy. We have to kind of sometimes hold back the judgments and assumptions that we want to make about people. That
okay. Tell us about negative automatic thoughts. A lot of these, you've written some articles on this stuff, the different types of thinking.
Yeah. And in fact, I have a book coming out with Ancient Faith next year about the good life. And chapter 6 is all about thinking errors. And so negative automatic thoughts, part of how we survive in the world without having to consciously think about every decision, everything that we encounter, is that our brain kind of has processes that automatically goes through. It kind of there are cognitions that kind of run in the background of our brain outside our choice and control, kind of like the operating system of a computer. These automatic thoughts are built up by experience, by habits, but they can be toxic. They can be negative. They can misfire and not do what they're meant to do. For example, automatic thoughts, the sheer volume of one thing coming into our mind and then going out and another thing and another thing, it can take away our inner stillness. We have to train ourselves to let our mind be still. So there's that issue, there's sort of the meta issue of the automatic thoughts, but then there's also the content of those thoughts can often be very toxic. We have to sometimes retrain our brain, catch ourselves in the middle. Oh yeah, no, I'm not going to take ownership of that thought. It's just going to come in and go out. I'm not going to take ownership of it. I'm not going to pick it up and start working with it.
Can I give an example? One of the things I practice a lot is meditation. And in meditation, we breathe through our nose in a rhythmic manner. You see these thoughts coming, but you are able to let them go because you're only thinking about your next breath.
Yes, that's an example. And there can be other things that help to focus your mind.
Is there like a machine that you could use to help?
There are machines. There are different technologies. One very simple technology is a prayer rope for Christians to be able to do the Jesus prayer. And I'm not just promoting prayer as a utilitarian tool to help us have better mental well-being, but that is one of the side effects of a contemplative prayer life, especially rooted in the Jesus prayer, is that it can help to slow down our minds. There are also machines, yes. There is a machine called the M-Wave that's put out by the Institute of Heart Math. And there are also neurotherapy or neurofeedback machines that can help our brains to achieve stillness by balancing the different brain waves that we have, like alpha waves, delta waves, beta waves.
Years ago, I ordered a biofeedback device from Earth Pulse Press, and you hooked it up, and it had electrodes so that every time your forehead moved, it would beep. So you learn to create stillness, and in the advertisement for it, it said that using this, you could achieve in 5 minutes what it would take people 20 years of meditation to achieve. Unfortunately, it was stolen when I had my stuff.
I'm sorry.
In storage, but
Did it detect electromagnetic signals within the brain,
it detected movement. It detected movement in the forehead. So you would sit and you would breathe, and then but anytime your body would start to stress, it would register in the movement in the forehead. So you learn by learning to keep really still, you wouldn't hear the beeping sound. And
fascinating.
I ordered it from Earth Pulse Press. Unfortunately, it was stolen with a lot of my other stuff.
I'm sorry to hear that. Maybe we could, maybe your listeners and I could team up and try to.
You get hooked up to a machine that makes you more smart, don't you?
Yes. In fact, every week.
If that's possible.
Yeah. Well, so every week I go into Spokane to have neurotherapy with some biofeedback machines, and they hook it up to my brain. It makes me smarter.
Can you talk to us about this? How's it work?
Well, it's very technical, and I'm still learning about it myself because my.
Is this the one that you talked about in the last interview that measures synchronicity in the heart?
Oh no, that's the M-Wave device for HeartMath. That measures heart rate variability. Um, they actually use that as well at the clinic I go to. But I go to a clinic where they hook my brain up to a very sophisticated and expensive. That's why I don't do it on myself. Well, that's one of the reasons I don't do it on myself. It's this $25,000 machine.
But what's it do?
Well, okay, so in the brain, we have different brain waves that all have a different frequency and amplitude that work synergistically with the other brain waves. So like alpha waves, delta waves, theta waves, and so forth. And when we're awake and when we're asleep, there are different frequencies and amplitudes that these brain waves flow at for optimum functioning. Now, when it can be different with our eyes open or with our eyes closed or when we're asleep, but scientists have measured what the right synergy is for these different brain waves. And if you have like not enough alpha waves, then you find it very hard to self-soothe. So a lot of people with alcoholism aren't producing enough alpha waves.
So it's like a biofeedback device.
I've given you the background. I haven't talked about the device yet. So I'm just explaining what happens in the brain. So disorders and dysfunction can arise when these brain waves aren't properly aligned. Like if you have too much theta waves, you can get brain fog, brain fatigue. It's like trying to think when you have the flu. That's background to what this device does. Well, one more piece of the picture. Okay, so we've got these different brain waves that are going in our brain that should ideally be working at specific amplitudes and frequencies. Okay, so in my case, my brain was overproducing theta waves, actually theta and alpha waves. Very creative. These people with too much theta and alpha, they tend to be very good meditators, very creative, but often there can be a brain fog. You can go around feeling like you're in a daze. And that's what I was experiencing. I had very bad mental burnout, very bad mental fatigue. It was affecting me professionally and personally. And so I went to get hooked up to this machine that lowers the theta and the alpha waves. And when those waves get lowered, then other waves like delta waves and low beta waves can go up.
How does it lower it?
Well, okay, so there's a wire that goes from your brain externally. It's non-invasive. It's like having brain surgery without having to cut the brain open. So the wire that detects electrical pulsation goes into a central hub that is connected to a DVD player. And then I watch a movie or listen to music from this DVD player, and the image and the sound are presented as they're not clear. The image is fuzzy and there's interference. But as the theta waves and the alpha waves go down, or whatever they decide to program it for, in my case, it's bringing the theta and alpha waves down, then the picture comes more into color, the sound becomes clearer at the level of milliseconds. So every millisecond, my brain is getting positive reinforcement for working more efficiently. And because my brain wants to see the movie clear and wants to be able to hear it properly, the brain self-corrects without me even having to do anything.
Sort of like binaural beats. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
I don't know what that is, but basically my experience is I'm just sitting and watching a movie, but my brain, because my brain is getting a reinforcement for working more efficiently, it trains it. It's like stretching, and afterwards I feel like my brain has just been stretched. It's a really weird feeling, but you do this every week over a 7-8 month period, maybe even a year and a half or 2 years, depending on what you need. Gradually, the brain learns learns these new habits that it's developed. And
Well, it reminds me of something that's popular called binaural beats, where you have two beats that are a little bit different going into each ear, but then there's enough of a discrepancy, but the brain puts them together. Probably a lot of our listeners will.
It's like that. It's like that. And you can, with a machine, you can make it so that those beats are lining up based on the input from the brain. And so at this clinic I go to, they did an EEG of my brain, did a brain map, and found that, oh yeah, you're really overproducing theta and alpha waves. That explains why you've been having this cognitive fatigue. I mean, it's so bad. Like if I overextended myself with writing, wrote an hour after I was fatigued, it'd be like sometimes days before I could write again. It's just like really dysfunctional. Let me just get to the end of the story. The end of the story is then halfway through it, they did another EEG and saw a significant improvement. And I'm to the point now where I do not struggle with mental fatigue more than I'm completely healed or almost completely healed. The mental fatigue that's still an issue, I can correct in normal ways. Have a nap, take a break,
That's
do
great.
some exercise. And so, yeah, I'm really thankful for this technology. And there's a great entry-level book about it for people who want to know more. It's called The Symphony in the Brain.
What kind of clinics offer this resource?
I don't know how to answer that. A lot of counseling practices are now incorporating it into their counseling practice. So, in fact, at the clinic I go to, everyone is a licensed professional counselor. But they're using this to treat alcoholism, ADD, ADHD, migraines, epilepsy, anxiety, depression. These are all some of the symptoms that can be treated by these biofeedback devices. And it's not like it's not a magic cure. If you have you have problems with addictions and alcoholism, you're going to need to do these protocols in conjunction with counseling and behavioral change and so forth.
A lot of people have brain fog these days because there's so many chemicals in our food and we're bombarded by electromagnetic radiation and all that sort of thing.
Yes, exactly.
A lot of people find that when they switch to a gluten-free diet, that a lot of the brain fog can go away. And I've read articles that say that's because so much of the wheat is sprayed with glyphosate.
Well, I don't know anything about that, but it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. Going back to the thinking errors, because that's something that's really impressed me over the years, reading your articles, and I want to go back to that. What is filtering?
Well, negative filtering is when we weed out the positives in the interaction or a relationship and just focus on the negatives.
Like when you get used to all the good things your wife does for you, and so then you take them for granted.
Yeah.
Focus on the negative.
It's easy for a husband to, like you say, get so used to his wife's good qualities that he starts taking them for granted, filtering them out. But then you focus on the negative. And it can also happen the other way, in just dysfunctionally. So a man is abusing his wife, but she says, oh, but we have great sex. So she's ignoring this huge mountain of problems, but filtering that out to just focus on the positive, and so sometimes that can be a virtue, but some focusing on the positive and
that's a big problem in Latin America, where husbands are notorious for sleeping around on the side.
Oh, gosh.
You'd be surprised how women put up with that.
But yeah, I mean, that's something I'd like to know more about. What sociological and what sociological factors lead to that sort of thing.
I think it's probably common to Latin cultures. They're very hot in terms of their sexual appetites. They don't seem to have a lot of control. But I don't really know. I just know that it's extremely common for husbands to cheat on their wives.
So there's a double standard between the sexes.
Yeah, for the most part, it's hard to generalize, but yeah, you'd be surprised how they put up with it.
Yeah. So Jonathan Edwards was a great American philosopher and theologian in the 18th century. And he talked about this a lot, because he was a naturally melancholy, kind of, moody type or emotional type person. And he really trained himself to not just filter out the positive and focus on the negative, but to reflect on what was good
But you've actually written a lot critical of Jonathan Edwards over the years, though, huh? Like your thesis on Gnosticism in colonial America.
Yes, and in my in the popular reworking of that PhD thesis, I'm going to try to give a little more balanced approach to Jonathan Edwards. He was the American philosopher. He wrote this about filtering. He said, "'Tis a most evil and pernicious practice in meditations on afflictions, to set ruminating on the aggravations of the affliction, and reckoning up the evil, dark circumstances thereof, and dwelling long on the dark side. It doubles and triples the affliction. When we focus on the negative, it actually amplifies the effect of it." And then he said, if we dwelt on the light side of things in our thoughts and extenuated them all possibly as much as we could when speaking of them, we should think little of them ourselves, and the affliction will really, in a great measure, vanish away. So we can, we don't want to have false optimism. We don't want to have a sentimental, artificial optimism. We can talk about what that is. But what Edwards is saying here is that instead of filtering out the good and just zeroing in on what's wrong, we should dwell on the lighter side of things, and then the negative side of things and our afflictions will seem less important.
So that's filtering. What is emotional reasoning?
So
is emotional reasoning the same as catastrophizing?
It's related, but there's a different nuance. So the best way to explain emotional reasoning is to give you some examples. So our minds and emotions were meant to work in synergy with each other. There's a feedback loop in the healthy person where the emotions and the reason are working in synergy. But what often happens is when that synergy breaks down and our thinking starts being dominated entirely by emotions. I'll give you some examples. What he did made me feel hurt, therefore it must have been wrong. Or I feel shame, therefore I must be a horrible person. If I'm scared about moving, then I shouldn't do it. I know my spouse is behaving inappropriately because otherwise, why would I feel jealous? Or I'll give you one more. I feel unlovable, therefore I know that nobody will ever accept me. These are examples of where our feelings misfire by driving our reasoning rather than our emotion and our reason working synergistically together. Does that make sense?
It sure does.
I'll give you one more that a lot of people feel. Because I broke my diet today or skipped my exercise, I feel like I'll never be able to follow through with anything again. And then sometimes these feelings, people will base their behavior on this emotional reasoning that is that doesn't have any basis in truth. So both our reason and our emotion has to be rooted in truth and has to work synergistically together to apprehend truth.
What is catastrophizing?
Catastrophizing is when we infer a dramatic pattern from insignificant events, or when we forecast the worst possible outcome to a situation. For example, the fact that I did such and such means that I'm a complete failure as a father. Or maybe when we dramatize other people's mistakes, when we blow them out of proportion. Like the fact that my wife believes that about me just proves we're incompatible. You know, where you take a small little thing and then you infer a dramatic conclusion out of it. Another example would be the fact that I can't afford to pay this bill must mean that I'm on the road to bankruptcy. You know, that's what I do often. I catastrophize. I can't pay this one bill, and therefore,
that would be
bankrupt. I have to reevaluate my entire financial
automatic thought.
Yeah. So all these thinking errors work. They feed off each other. So the catastrophizing leads to the automatic thoughts, and then the negative automatic thoughts lead to more catastrophizing. And then when we're in relationships with other people, this then causes us to start mind reading.
What about overgeneralizing? What would that be?
It's similar to catastrophizing. It's when we hastily infer a pattern out of a single incident. So, for example, something happens in the morning, and then you think, oh, I'm going to have a bad day. Or you're trying a new thing and you fail, and you think, oh, I always fail when I try new things. Or maybe your spouse does something annoying, and then you say, oh, he's always doing things like that. When we infer a general pattern out of an isolated event, and often, and we do this with people, with groups of people, with races. We'll say like, oh, children always rebel when they become teenagers, or in some Christian circles, a normal Christian wife just submissively allows her husband to boss her around. We'll make these generalizations that hurt people and which are not healthy for our brain or for our relationships.
That would be like the basis of racism, huh? When you overgeneralize. Maybe you had a bad experience with somebody from one race, so then you think everybody from that race is the same way.
Yeah. And this is kind of the overgeneralizing plays into what's called the fundamental attribution error, where you assume that people's behavior is motivated by general characteristics rather than, and then you overlook things in the context that explain the behavior. So he did such and such, therefore he's dishonest, or therefore he's this or that, rather than looking at aspects of the context that may explain what happened. There's been a ton of fascinating research on the fundamental attribution error. I don't feel I did a very good job of explaining it, but basically it's the idea that we overlook the context and what's the case in our environment to assume that people's behavior is flowing out of something that's intrinsic to their nature. And this is what the Stanford prison experiment fits into this. They got one set of students to be the guards, and another set of students to be the prisoners. It was randomly assigned, and the guards started abusing the prisoners. Well, it wasn't because of anything within their character, because the same pool of people were randomly assigned to both groups. It's because of the environment. when
Could
you
have
have,
also been because they were in a position of authority.
well, that's what I mean. That is the environment. What I meant by the environment. When you put people in a position of unlimited authority over other people, the temptation is to abuse it. And it's very hard.
Absolute power corrupts, absolutely.
Exactly. And so that's, how did we get on that? Oh yeah, we're talking about overgeneralizing the fundamental attribution error. Yeah, it's all this stuff is so fascinating.
On the Robin and Boom show, you talk about polarized thinking. Can you talk to us about what is polarized thinking?
I can't remember talking about that on the Robin and Boom show. Do you remember which episode it was?
How there's really no American culture per se, that nothing that everybody holds on to that is in agreement, and so people latch onto all these kind of polarized thinking.
Oh yes, yeah, and tribalism. Yeah, the collapse of any shared common meta narrative has led to tribalism and so forth. But
So I guess two things going on. Why don't you talk to us about how there's no shared meta narrative, and then we can go on to the polarized thinking.
yes, well, Jason Van Boom would do a better job of explaining this than I would. But cultures are sustained by shared beliefs, symbols, practices, and the aggregate of a people's shared symbols, beliefs, practices, traditions. That's called their meta narrative. And what's happening in America is the meta narratives that are collapsing. There's increasingly nothing that unites us as Americans in the way that it used to be. And so then we latch onto substitute meta narratives, micro narratives. There's that word again. It doesn't have to do with microaggression, although micro narratives can certainly lead to microaggressions. But
what are some micro narratives?
Like race, so I stopped seeing myself as American and for my identity and my politics and my ideology based on my race. This leads to a lot of the white supremacy that we have now.
Or your ideology becomes based on your gender, or
yes,
or political ideology. Your identity
exactly. So
linked to like being a socialist or something.
Exactly. And so in America now we have identity politics, where our political views and our whole worldview is based on the group that you identify with. So maybe one person's they're feminist, another person is a Republican, another person is LGBTQ, and that then becomes a lens by which you evaluate all of life, and especially how you navigate within the political sphere.
Sure. Yeah, we can see that happening even today.
Yeah. So the absence of shared traditions, the absence of shared meta narratives causes a fracturing into all these different micro narratives, and then our public discourse just becomes a circus to see who can shout the loudest. So we talk past each other because we're not really interested in understanding the other person. Understanding means being able to really listen attentively from your heart and being able to summarize back what the other person is saying in a way that they can say that's fair, and then interacting with that. We're not interested anymore, by and large, in having that type of attentive, intelligent discussion in our public discourse.
And I think that the mainstream media feeds on this, and it's like they're encouraging the balkanization of all these little microcultures and encouraging the polarization.
Yes, the mainstream media has been accelerating this tribalism, and as has Donald Trump as well. I have an article on my blog about the Republican retreat to identity politics. Identity politics has primarily historically been within the radical left playbook. I talked about that in my book, Saints and Scoundrels. But recently, we are having we're seeing that picked up by the right. And
I remember, if I could just interrupt, I remember during the campaign when Trump criticized the judge, and he said he's Mexican, and Trump was called a racist. If you remember that situation, a judge ruled on something to do with one of Trump's private businesses, and Trump accused him of bias for being a Mexican, and the media said, oh, this proves that Trump is a racist. Bernie Sanders came out and said, this shows beyond a doubt that Trump is a racist. But then what they didn't tell you about the judge is he was actually part of a group that was the equivalent of the Mexican version of the KKK. So, and they don't even say that. So it's like they don't report about the stuff that could be really relevant. So it makes it seem like Trump is a racist, but they're not telling the whole story. They don't talk about very relevant information. So it's okay to be a racist if you're a Mexican, or it's okay to be racist against whites if you're black, according to the media narratives.
Yeah. There's definitely some bias going on there.
And it's exactly the opposite of what the leaders of the civil rights movement before, like Cesar Chavez or Martin Luther King, it's exactly the opposite of what they were after.
I know. If you advocate the type of colorblind state that Martin Luther King Jr. wanted, you can be accused of being a racist.
Yeah, that's funny.
But you asked about polarized thinking, so which kind of relates to this. So polarized thinking, it's also called splitting, where you divide everything into black and white. So, for example, if you think that all conservatives are intelligent people and all liberals are stupid, or vice versa, or getting back to the fundamental attribution error, if you think that you observe something that somebody said and then conclude they're either totally trustworthy or totally untrustworthy, where you make these sweeping judgments that divide things into black and white. It's related to overgeneralizing as well. You can see how kind of all these thinking errors kind of play off each other.
Did we talk about the thinking error of mind reading?
We did. Okay. And so part of the problem with polarized thinking is that it leads to an all or nothing mentality, and where like, and do you know what I mean by that, all or nothing mentality?
I think so, but why don't you elaborate?
Like we might approach a problem with ourselves or with a family member and think, unless that's going to be solved perfectly, there's no point in even trying to solve it partially. Or many creative projects of would-be artists and composers and so forth, they flounder because you have all or nothing mentality. Unless I can do this perfectly, I don't even want to do it at all. And a mature person is able to live with ambiguity and accept that sometimes people and situations, they can't be nicely divided into black and white. There's gray. A lot of the time. And obviously, you can take this too far. I'm not going into relativism. I'm not talking about the moral realm, but within life, sometimes the neat and tidy categories that we put things in, they don't do justice to the complexity and the ambiguity of real life.
Yeah. Speaking of creative projects, what are you working on these days? You said you were having a book coming out?
Yes, I'm having a book with Ancient Faith is publishing my book on the good life.
And Ancient Faith Radio, you've been on Ancient Faith Radio before. Is this thing?
Yes, this is the publishing arm of Ancient Faith Radio.
And what do you mean by the good life? Give us what are some chapters? What are the chapters about?
Okay, yeah, I just want to say I do have to be going soon. But
actually, that was going to be my last question. So
okay,
we're on the same wavelength here.
Well, I have a, I don't know how much I want to reveal before the book is published, but I guess this can,
okay.
this can kind of be an advertisement for it. So the first chapter is about self-acceptance, why it's okay to be you, and why is it okay to be me, and that can sound very sort of humanistic and so forth, but I really put it within a biblical orthodox context by contrasting the scriptural and patristic emphasis of self-acceptance and self-compassion, and contrasting that with the secular humanist idea of self-esteem. And so self-esteem is bad, self-compassion is good. And
Self-esteem can actually lead to neurosis, can it not?
exactly, there's been studies. Self-esteem leads us to it, it's very hard to be humble if you have self-esteem, because you're committed to affirming things about yourself that may or may not be true. And the studies of school children have found that self-esteem can lead to bullying and violent behavior in response to threatened egotism. So if my ego is threatened, I can become defensive or even violent. This is what self-esteem encourages. And so this first chapter of my book is about why self-esteem is not a Christian concept, but self-compassion and self-acceptance, properly defined, are Christian concepts. There is a sense in which we are to love ourselves. Now, I know people will disagree with that. People will say that's wrong, but to properly love yourself is to want what is best for you. Just like if I love you, which I do, I want what's best for you. Loving ourselves properly is to want what's best for us, and what's best for us is defined by Jesus Christ.
And there's no shortcuts to that.
There's no shortcuts. There's no shortcuts to true flourishing. True human flourishing has a transcendent horizon. Our goal is not this life. Our goal is a union with Jesus that continues after we are dead, and that we need to look beyond the hedonistic, egotistic goals of this life to what flourishing really involves.
Yeah. Any
that's
last thoughts?
That's the first chapter.
I want to thank you, Robin, for doing this again. I've really enjoyed it, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us. And
absolutely, and maybe sometime I could interview you about your experiences in South America, because I'm really fascinated in the cultural differences, what you've observed about culture and the people, how in South America it's different.
Well, I'm a high school teacher, so I could talk about how education is approached. I see there's some really good things about how education is approached, but there's also some things that are different from the US that make it harder. But as an English teacher, I'm there to fill in the gap. And if they taught English perfectly, then I wouldn't have a job. But I could talk about some of the ways that they approach education that are good and bad.
I'd be very interested in that. Well, thank you so much for having me on your show. Thank you for letting me do a sort of sales pitch for my new book.
Sure.
And I should say that summary was just about the first chapter. The rest of the book, we get into things like thinking errors, gratitude,
Gnosticism.
No, not Gnosticism. That's my next book.
Not this time.
But just redefining the good life in terms of not what's going on around you, but what's going on in here. So thank you for letting me do a little sales pitch for that.
You're welcome, buddy.
On your show again.
So long, chum.
Bye-bye.